Well, I graduated of Howard University, formerly trained as an artist, a designer. And it wasn't until I visited the King Tut exhibit when it came to Washington, D.C. in 1977 that I first began my journey in my African history. I saw that exhibit the first time through the eyes of an artist, and I was totally captivated by what I had seen. And after that, I read an article in Sepia magazine, an article written by attorney LeGrand Clegg, who's now a good friend of mine. The article was entitled "The Great King Tut Ripoff." He talked about how that presentation, the King Tut exhibit, when it came to the United States, had intentionally been organized so as to not to portray Egyptian history as being a legitimate part of African history. And after having read that article and seen the photographs, I went back to see that exhibit again, and I saw it through totally different eyes. I could see myself in that exhibit. And it was then that I began to realize how thoroughly miseducated I had been. I attended black schools all my life and had never been exposed to what I felt was true information about my history, my culture, and I realized that I would have to begin to assume responsibility for educating myself. And I attended lectures and read books, and then in 1980, I made my first trip to Egypt with Dr. Ben, and I can truly say that my life has not been the same since then.
You were just in Japan and England. How was that trip? How did that go?
Well, I was invited to Japan by a group of brothers and sisters at an Air Force base in Misawa, which is 400 miles north of Tokyo. And I was invited as their keynote speaker for a Black History Month program. And it was a inspirational event in that this was the first time that they had organized to bring someone in stateside to participate in the Black History Month program. And they were thoroughly enthralled by the information. These were people who were thirsty for knowledge and information. And fortunately, a core group of them have been exposed to the books, and as a matter of fact, they've seen many of your programs there. And they were able to make arrangements through their superiors at the military base to bring me out to do the presentation. And as a result, we have initiated an international chapter of our organization, the Institute of Karmic Guidance. We're assisting them in developing study groups on the base so that they can begin to proliferate this information about African history and culture, not only to the military personnel, but to their children. There are literally hundreds of children of African descent who attend high schools and elementary schools on those military bases who have never been exposed to any of this information. And so there are parents there now who understand the value of this knowledge and want to make sure that their children are exposed to it.
Your book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, is a tremendous piece of work. Why did you write it?
Well, I wrote the book because I had a story that I wanted to share with people, and essentially this story comes out of my desire to learn about my history and my culture and to share that information. As I stated earlier, I'm formally trained as an artist or designer, and so what I wanted to do in designing this book was to use my artistic talents to visually tell a story about our history and our culture. And in laying out each page, selecting the photographs, and actually doing the illustrations helped me to tell this story through visual images. I do believe in the adage that a picture's worth 1,000 words, and for people that may not be inclined to read a lot, there are pictures there to captivate your interest.
Well, if you would, let us take a look at this powerful presentation of yours, please, these pictures that you do have.
Well, essentially it's a 6,000-year overview of African history and culture and our contributions to that culture. And it begins with this advertisement that was published by the now defunct corporation Eastern Airlines. It asks a question that makes the statement, before there was American history, there was black history.
On the monitor
history is accurately portrayed as African or Egyptian history. This is important because we find that we have continually been written out of history, particularly our own history. During the month of February, I'm usually invited to speak quite a bit on this subject matter, but the only thing that disturbs me about that is that it seems as though the only time we're allowed to talk about our history and our culture is February, Black History Month, which is the shortest month of the year that's been set aside to commemorate the history of the oldest people on the planet. The other interesting aspect about this particular ad is that it's only during the month of February when you will find ads such as this, and you will only find them in predominantly African-centered publication. Essence, Newsweek, Jet, not Newsweek, but Ebony. You would never find them in time, in life.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's as if we are the only ones who are supposed to know our history, and the only time we are allowed to become aware of that history is during Black History Month. And in reality, once you get a glimpse or a taste of our story, you begin to realize that it is so important a story that it cannot be limited to 1 month out of the year.
Could it also be that they do not want other people to know our history?
Well, as Asa Hilliard has said on numerous occasions, the story of African people is a story of world history. It should not be limited just to people of African descent, because the world has benefited greatly from the historical accomplishments of African people. And so when we talk about those accomplishments, we have to begin with the first documented culture and civilization, which is ancient Egypt.
We have the young people from Columbia High School and Citizen School in Columbia, South Carolina here with us. We're very glad to have them with us. And I wonder if they know how old Africans are. I wonder if they know how old they are.
Well, I would dare say that if they've gone through the same educational system that I went through and you went through, they probably don't. This is not information that is taught in public school systems throughout the country. Therefore, it's important that we view our history as important, view our history as sacred, and teach it to not only our children, but other children, so that they can begin to see us through different eyes.
I'm almost tempted to ask some of the youngsters how old they think African people are. Who feels like tackling that question? How old? How long have African people been on the planet? Anybody feel like tackling that? Brother right here. Hold on 1 minute. Let's get your microphone.
Which one?
Stand up, please. As tall as you are, why would you want to sit down? Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I was wondering, because like from earliest parts of civilization, or as I know that dates have been recorded of civilization from Earth, on Earth, has first been here. It was like found in Africa from archaeological digs and stuff, you know. And I was go back to, I think they were saying about well, at least 10 million years or something. So, you know, I was wondering, could it be, have Africans been that long, you know?
Well, you know, the archaeological evidence shows that the oldest skeletal remains of humans have only been found in Africa. Humanoids has only been found in Africa, and it's also in Africa where the first Homo sapiens sapiens, true modern man, evolved. And it was from Africa that this man left the continent and then migrated into what is now Europe and Asia, and is speciated to become the various races that now inhabit the planet. So it has been archaeologically and genetically proven that the first people on the planet were of African descent. So for us not to know that, for the world not to know that, means that our history has literally been kept away from us. And this is knowledge and information that is vitally important, not only to us, but to our children as well.
And they're saying that age is about 200 to 250,000 years old. So that's how old you are. You look pretty young to be so old, right? Okay. Go on, Tony.
Well, sure. In terms of talking about culture and civilization, Nile Valley is important because it is there where we can find the oldest documented evidence of a culture and civilization. We can find architecture, writing, philosophy, religion, science, engineering. And that's the reason why I was so captivated with the research of Dr. Ben, and why I've been going there for the last 13 years. When we look at architecture, Imhotep is the person that we must be knowledgeable of, because he is recorded in history, not just African history.
That's the next slide? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
He is recorded in history as the world's first multi-genius. He was a philosopher, the Grand Vizier, Prime Minister to the Pharaoh Zoser, the architect of the Step Pyramid.
Well, if we can see that slide, please. Okay,
he's also the architect of the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. But what's equally significant is the fact that he is recorded in history as the world's first physician. Now, what's important is that when you hear this information, it's natural for you to ask the question, well, wait a minute, I remember being told that Hippocrates is the father of history. Well, when you study Greek history, you'll find that it was the Greeks who were responsible for renaming Egypt, renaming the country of Kemet and calling it Egypt, and most of the names of people, places, and things within that country. Imhotep's name was changed to Asclepius. So if you look at the Hippocratic Oath, you see that they even acknowledge this African as the god of medicine. The building that Imhotep designed is the step pyramid of Saqqara, which is the oldest man-made structure on the planet. This is the next slide. The oldest man-made structure on the planet stands approximately 197 stories tall. So when we look at this building, when we look at this skyscraper, we have to realize that this challenges the myths about African people living in caves.
197 stories?
197 feet high, I'm sorry.
Okay.
19 stories, yes,
right.
19 stories tall. And this challenges the misconceptions that we've been given about African people living in caves or living in trees.
And this was built around what time?
Around approximately 2700 BCE. The first man-made structure on the planet, and it is still standing today in Egypt, in the country that was originally called Kemet. It's also vitally important to show the faces of the individuals associated with this particular point in time in history. The next slide shows us the king Zoser, the man for whom Imhotep designed and constructed this building. And if you look at that face, you can clearly see those telltale features that were often destroyed by invaders, the broad noses, the full lips, the high cheekbones. It was only thousands of years later when the ethnicity of these people would be called into question because of the attempt to remove Egypt from Africa.
So this is the king of what we today call Egypt.
Yes. At that point in time in history, he was the most powerful man on the planet, the wealthiest man on earth. And this is an aspect of history. This is world history, not just African history. This is an aspect of history that most people know nothing about.
This is before Columbus.
This is at least, brother, way before Columbus's mama. You know, we can go back real far. But it's important for us to understand where we were in history. The next slide is a photograph of two objects that most of us are familiar with. The statue that's been referred to by the Greeks as the Sphinx, and the other structure referred to as the pyramid. This site is at Giza, which is probably one of the most significant archaeological sites on the planet. There have been more digs done at Giza. There have been more books written about these two objects than any other in history. Again, they reflect the historical, the educational, the engineering accomplishments of African people thousands of years ago. Now, this next slide shows us a more detailed shot of the pyramids. And it's important when you look at the structure that you're looking at the Great Pyramid of Khufu, which is in the background. You're looking at a structure which was up until 109 years ago when the Washington Monument was built. This building was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. It stands approximately 450 feet high. It is as tall as a 45-story building. It comprises an area of 13 acres, 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide. Comprised of over 2.5 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each. There's enough stone in this one building to make 30 Empire State Buildings. And it's important to understand that this building was designed by Africans, for Africans. It was not built by slave labor, and of course it was not built by Jews during their so-called occupation in Egypt. This building was constructed over 1,000 years before the first Jew, Abraham, was born. So again, this structure, which is the only remaining wonder of the original 7 wonders of the earth, is a testimonial to the brilliance and the genius which developed along the Nile Valley. The next slide that we see is a photograph of probably what is now regarded as one of the oldest sculptures in existence. The Greeks call it the Sphinx. The African name for this structure is Heramakit. It is 240 feet long, 66 feet high. It has the head of a man, the body of a lion, and embodies the spiritual concepts of the people of Kemet. The body of a lion represents the animal nature, symbolizes the animal nature which exists in human beings. The head of a man represents divine intelligence, which we all have. And the combination of these two elements together represents the reality that when you are able to refine your thinking through knowledge and education, you are able to suppress the lower animal nature or the bestial nature which exists within you.
Say that again, please. Say that again.
When you are able to refine your mind through education, you are able to suppress the lower animal nature which exists within you. Let me give you an example of that. And we use very colorful metaphors today to describe animalistic tendencies that human beings sometimes exhibit. If you invite someone over to your house and they have poor table manners, you might accuse them of eating like a pig. Brothers use terminology to describe sisters. They may call them foxes or chicks. Sisters sometimes, justifiably so, may accuse brothers of treating them like dogs. Okay, we use metaphors, animalistic metaphors, to describe behavior, animalistic behavior that humans sometimes exhibit. The lion is regarded as the king of the beasts. It represents the king of this animal nature which exists within us.
Right.
And when you look at this statue, you see that this lion, this 240-foot long body of this lion, is sitting down very calmly, very quietly. It is under the control of a refined mind. This to me represents the heart and soul of the spirit of the people of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. When you look at the face of that statue, this 13-foot wide face of this statue, you see the face of an African, but it's also important that we understand that the nose and the lips were shot off of this statue, I believe, by Napoleon during his occupation of Egypt. Napoleon came upon the statue, which was, at that time in July of 1798, literally buried up to its neck in sand.
What do you think is the symbolic legacy, the message for left in that piece of art, that piece of sculpture, for African-American youngsters today, but Africans around the world?
Well, the statue is called Her Maquette, Heru on the horizon. Heru is the son of God. Heru, the statue symbolizes, again, to me, the statue symbolizes the power of the Creator that are inherent within every individual. It faces the east. It faces the rising sun. And the sun was a symbol of Heru. And so every morning, this statue is greeted with his metaphysical counterpart. The sun, the light from the sun, illuminates the face of Heru, which symbolizes the power of the Creator, the knowledge of the Creator which exists within us, which we must cultivate in order to raise the standard of life for us through our understanding of who we are.
Okay.
As I stated earlier, it's important to understand that the destruction of the nose of this statue and the lips of this statue was intentional. In Egypt, you'll find that there are about 75 to 80% of the statues are missing heads and noses and lips. And most of those are statues of people who can be clearly identified as African in appearance. And this is no accident. It's an attempt to disassociate African people from this culture and civilization. So
it might be good to clarify, when people, the young people here, see Egyptians today, and they hear you say that, well, the Egyptians created the world's first civilization, they may look at the people who are now in Egypt,
yes,
and think that you're talking about those people. Would you clarify that, please?
Surely. The Egyptian of today is no more a true Egyptian than the people of the United States of America are the true inhabitants of this land. When we talk about Egypt, we're talking about a country that was renamed after the Greek occupation around 332 BCE. Egypt was originally called Kemet, which means the land of the blacks. It was a country that was formulated as a nation approximately 3200 BCE. It was a nation that was ruled by African people for over 3,000 years until they fell victim to invasions from the north. From that time on, if you study a timeline, a pictorial timeline of these personalities in ancient Kemet, you'll find that all of the great rulers were African. It was only after Egypt was invaded by first the Persians and then the Greeks that the leadership changed. And from that point on, after the invasion of the Greeks, Egypt was invaded by the Romans, and then came the Arabs, then came the French, then came the British and the Turks. So the Egyptians that we see today are a combination of all of these peoples. But there does exist in Upper Egypt, in the area of Aswan, the descendants of the original inhabitants of Kemet. These are called the Nubians. The culture began up south and migrated northward down the Nile. So the further south you go, the closer you are to the original people of this land. And then it's important to understand that reality.
Maybe if you talk some about what Egypt produced, that would explain to the students here why Egypt is so important. Why, you know, why we aren't talking about Nigeria. Not that Nigeria is not important.
Sure.
But why we're not talking about some other country. You know, why is Egypt so important?
Well, Egypt represents the culmination of the culture and civilization that developed in the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley is approximately 4,200 miles long. And that culture navigated or migrated northward down the Nile, and so the country that we now call Egypt represents the culmination of the greatness that existed within the Nile Valley. It is there where we can find the beginnings of writing, the so-called hieroglyphs, which is a non-African word. The word hieroglyphs means sacred carvings. The African name for this writing form is Medu Neter, which means the word of God or the writing of God. It is there where we can find the first evidence of architecture, as I stated earlier, with Imhotep and his works. We can find the beginnings of engineering when we look at the temples and the monuments, the beginning of writing, philosophy, mathematics. When you understand something about the infrastructure that was necessary to govern a nation of hundreds of thousands of
And
people.
geometry?
And geometry.
And so for when they go to school, they're not getting the information that's before them in terms of mathematics.
Has been presented as not African. Euclid studied mathematics in Africa, okay, and then came back to Greece and presented the Euclidean theory. This is not a Greek invention. Most of the Greek philosophers studied in Africa. So when you trace the origins of what we now call the rudimentary aspects of culture and civilization, we can find that the people responsible for creating them studied in Africa. And so what I'm talking about is going back to the source, not the secondary sources, but going back to the primary sources and studying the origins of these things in Africa.
And so math and geometry, etc., this is nothing alien for young people.
No, of course.
For young African Americans.
Of course not. Of course not. And again, if you understood this, then you would begin to realize that this is nothing that should intimidate you. Math is as natural part of your abilities as is playing basketball. Basketball involves a certain degree of mathematical thinking. In terms of dribbling the ball, in terms of shooting. So these are things that we need to look at and understand from an entirely different perspective.
Okay. I want to get to the rest of these pictures.
Okay, well,
I'm going to hush up for a minute.
The next image we see here is a photograph of a temple, which represents, it embodies the essence of the educational systems which were developed in Egypt. These were the first universities. It is where African men and women studied the heavens. It's where they built libraries which contained thousands and thousands of books which documented their research. This is a particular slide of the temple of Ramesses at Luxor, and it's important to understand that it's from this base that the knowledge which helped to create Greece sprang from. The next image we see is that of a scene that is commonly referred to as the weighing of the soul, and it represents some of the spiritual and philosophical concepts which came out of Egypt. This is a scene that represents the judgment of the soul of a man who has died and comes before God to have a determination made as to whether or not he will go to heaven or hell. This represents African concepts of the soul, the salvation of the soul, judgment, heaven or hell, that existed over 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. And in this particular scene, the soul of a man stands before the image of Ma'at to have his soul weighed on the scale of truth and justice. And you see a scale there. And on the right side of the balance, you see the feather, which
That's
represents
with the T-looking, cross-looking thing almost, okay?
And on the right side of the balance, you see the feather, which symbolizes Ma'at. Ma'at is the African goddess who represents the principles of truth, justice, righteousness, order, and reciprocity. On the left side of the balance, you see a symbol which represents the heart of the deceased man. because in the African tradition it was believed that the heart was the seat of the soul, hence the title of this drawing, The Weighing of the Soul of the Deceased. And the idea that was expressed in this scene is that when this man comes to have his soul weighed against the feather of Ma'at, if his heart is symbolically as light as a feather, it means that he has lived a righteous life according to the principles of the Africans, and he can go on and reap his reward in heaven. Jehudi, the bird-headed figure, records this event in the Book of Judgment, and all of this activity takes place before Asar, who is seated on the far right on the throne of judgment, and who makes the final determination.
That's the name they had for God?
Yes.
What we call God today?
Yes. And he makes the final determination as to whether or not the soul of this man goes to heaven or hell. Concepts now that were not foreign to African people before the introduction of Christianity.